And welcome back to the trial of the nurse Lucy Letby. In this video I'm going to be covering for you the closing speech given by Nicholas Johnson KC on behalf of the prosecution. Mr. Johnson refers to the cases of twins child L and child M. He says fluids were calculated for child L by Dr. Bomick. Letby had recorded, quote, "Myself and shift leader A. Davies have discussed this with Registrar Bomick as it does not follow the hypoglycemia pathway." Amy Davies does not recall this conversation. Mr. Johnson says Letby was setting up an issue for child L. Child L's blood sugar level had improved, so monitoring was not required. Nurse Tracy Jones said she didn't change the dextrose bag during her shift. Mr. Johnson says for the day shift of April 9th, 2016, Mary Griffith was the designated nurse for child L and child M on a busy shift. Mr. Johnson says if people were very busy, then they might not have time to monitor what Letby was up to. Mary Griffith was certainly out of the room by 9:30 AM, as she was in room 4 administering medication to children in there. He says that means during that time Lucy Letby would have been alone with child L. He says that would have been when the insulin was put into child L's dextrose bag, as Professor Hindmarsh in evidence said it had to have been done by 9:30 AM. A blood sample taken for child L, taken at 10 AM, showed an increase in the amount of dextrose given but a drop in the level of blood sugar, when the opposite should have been true. Mr. Johnson says the finger point of evidence is the ratio between insulin and insulin C-peptide later recorded. The podding of the blood sample was delayed due to child M's collapse. The timing of the sample taken must be taken from several accounts. Mr. Johnson says it must have been taken around 3:45 PM. The blood sample would have been treated as urgent. The nurse said she had been distracted by an emergency with child M, which was timed at 4 PM. The blood was put into a vial and then an envelope and labelled. The request for the blood test was entered at 3:45 PM on a lab specimen internal inquiry form at the Countess of Chester Pathology. The form is shown to the court. The process and analysis were interrupted by Lucy Letby's attack on child M. An infusion therapy sheet for a 10% dextrose prescription at 3:40 PM is shown to the court. Mr. Johnson says this explains why the lab result shows a slightly higher blood sugar reading for child L than the other readings, and that the blood sample was taken at 3:45 PM. Dr. John Gibbs said the low blood sugar level should have meant the level of insulin in child L was also low. He said it had never occurred to him that someone was administering insulin to child L. He said he never received a lab result for child L. They went to a junior doctor who didn't appreciate its significance at the time. Mr. Johnson said scientist Dr. Sarah Davies had phoned through the results to the hospital as they were so unusual. The lab at Liverpool was performing very well, and Mr. Johnson says it can be discounted as a possibility that the lab results were in any way misleading. He adds it speaks volumes that the levels of insulin were double that found for child E months earlier. The poisoner Lucy Letby had upped the dose for child L. He says as for timings, the insulin was put in the bag after it was hung for child L. Mr. Johnson says Letby was co-responsible for hanging up the bag for child L at noon on April 9th, and had also co-signed for the previous bag on April 8th at noon. Professor Hindmarsh says the bag was not poisoned before midnight on April 8th, 9th, as the blood sugar readings are following an upward trend for child L. Insulin must have been put in between midnight and 10 AM on April 9th. Mr. Johnson says insulin went into the bag sometime before or at 9:36 AM, given insulin's half-life of 24 minutes. Mr. Johnson says this is a targeted attack. This is not a random poisoning. He says whoever is responsible must have been on duty between midnight and 9:36 AM. He says Letby came on duty between 7:30 and 8 AM on April 9th. The insulin that poisoned child L was put into more than one bag. All of the staff on duty have denied responsibility for this. Mr. Johnson says the first poisoning was when the bag was already hanging, and the second one was administered to child L as well. He says at 9:30 a.m. on April 9th, Mary Griffith was in room 4. She was not working on the day when child L was poisoned. A third bag was being put together for child L at the time child M collapsed. Mr. Johnson asks if somebody did this to frame Lucy Letby, and if she didn't do this, then somebody also targeted child L and targeted Lucy Letby to take the blame. We suggest that is not a reasonable possibility. That is why all of the other cases are so important. They are not coincidences. Mr. Johnson moves to child M, who was a picture of health after his birth and was doing just fine. The fact that his twin was poisoned puts this case into sharp relief. What are the chances of a healthy baby boy collapsing in such an extreme way? The evidence, as you have heard from the doctors, is not very big. What are the chances of this happening at the same time his brother was poisoned? Mr. Johnson says circumstantial evidence can be very, very powerful, and this is a case where it is. Child M suffered a profound collapse, from which he made a miraculous recovery. How many times have you heard that before in this case? Dr. Anthony Yuko had noted there were issues with aspirates and a slightly distended abdomen for child M, but nothing to indicate he was to become seriously unwell. On April the 9th at 3:30 p.m, he was put onto 10% dextrose, co-signed by Lucy Letby and Mary Griffith. He did not get a bag with insulin in, Mr. Johnson tells the court. Mr. Johnson says Mary Griffith was about to take a blood sample for child L and make up a 12.5% dextrose solution, which would take time. Mr. Johnson says Letby would have administered this 10% dextrose infusion for child M. The parents of child L and child M had given evidence to say one of the doctors was pressing child M's chest 10 minutes after we had left the boys. Child M had gone from fine to life-threatening emergency CPR, and the father was left praying. He says it can be discounted this was all unlucky coincidence. Mr. Johnson refers to a paper towel on the resuscitation notes for child M, which found its way under its own steam to Letby's home. It, quote, came home with me. Sounds like a dog following someone home, doesn't it? Her explanation was, I collect paper. How long has Lucy Letby had to come up with a reason? Here we are 7 years later, and her best reason is, I collect paper. Most collectors know what they collect. It's absolute nonsense. He adds, somebody sabotaged child M, didn't they? The attacks were almost signature, as child M deteriorated and 6 adrenaline doses were given. It is a signature of the consequences of many of these attacks. Child M was at the very edge of life, and the resuscitation took 30 minutes with no response. 20 minutes is the usual watershed, according to Dr. Ravi Jairam. Dr. Jairam then had the difficult conversation with the parents, but child M had a miraculous recovery. Dr. Jairam wasn't sure what he had done to make child M recover. Dr. Jairam had noted skin discoloration on child M that flitted around, appearing and disappearing. Dr. Jairam had said because child M was darker skinned, it was more obvious. He added, I have never seen this before in a child. Letby, in interview and cross-examination, had suggested the lighting in room 1 was not very good, and that was a possible reason why she could not see what Dr. Jairam had seen. If we refer to child I, Letby could see in very poor lighting what her condition was. Dr. Jairam had asked in cross-examination if he was being accused of making things up. What is Lucy Letby's case if Dr. Jairam is making things up? Mr. Johnson said it had been suggested Dr. Jayram had, in cross-examination, added dramatic detail by mentioning the skin discoloration descriptions but not recording it contemporaneously in notes at the time, and had been accused of dramatic detail when he said a shiver had gone down his spine when he first read about the effects of air embolus. We suggest that not only is Letby murdering babies, she is also prepared to trash the reputations of professional people in order to get away with it. Mr. Johnson says after the collapse of Child M, the night shift of April 9th-10th happened, and a Countess doctor described there was a plan to remove Child M's ET tube following an astonishing recovery. He was put onto BiPAP within 12 hours, and there was no cause for concern for a child who had had such a devastating collapse. Dr. Gibbs had queries about NEC and sepsis at the time, but those could be excluded by following evidence. Child M required a dose of caffeine for a slowing breathing rate at the end of the following day. Dr. Stiveros later said Child M had suffered a brain injury. Mr. Johnson says this was a result of the collapse. Mr. Johnson says a fairly typical picture in this case is of babies collapsing rapidly and unexpectedly and recovering just as quickly. Medical expert Dr. Evans said there had been no reason to do blood tests for infection, and the subsequent test ruled that out in any case. Dr. Evans and Dr. Sandy Bowen had said the cause of the collapse was an air embolus. Mr. Johnson says there had been evolving means of attack by Lucy Letby. Mr. Johnson says there is only one conclusion, as said at the beginning of the trial. There was a poisoner at work in the Countess of Chester Hospital's neonatal unit. He says it has not been suggested by Letby or the defence that anyone was responsible for poisoning Child F and Child L. Child F was poisoned with 2 bags, and Child L was poisoned with at least 2 bags until the 15% dextrose bag was fitted and he began to improve. Lucy Letby and Belinda Simcock were the only ones present when both Child F and Child L were poisoned. You can dismiss the possibility that 2 murderers were working in the same unit at the same time. Mr. Johnson says Letby has rowed back from disputing the accuracy of the insulin readings between her defence and giving evidence in court. He says it will be interesting how the defence gets her out of that particular creek. Mr. Johnson moves to the case of Child K. He recalls the evidence heard by Dr. Ravi Jayram that Lucy Letby was standing over Child K, the alarm was not sounding, and she did nothing. Mr. Johnson says Letby had displaced Child K's ET tube. The Child K case shines a bright light for what happened in Child E, when Letby was almost caught red-handed. Mr. Johnson tells the court Nurse Joanne Williams said it was strange Child K desaturated 2 further times, and the second and third incidents saw Child K well sedated. The 6:15am desaturation, the second incident, happened between 6:07am and 23 seconds and 6:15am, Mr. Johnson tells the court. An X-ray timestamped at 6:07am and 23 seconds shows Child K's X-ray with a report the ET tube was in satisfactory position. By 6:15am, Child K was desaturating. Mr. Johnson says the tube had gone down her throat, then had to be removed. How on earth had that happened in a 25-week-old gestational age baby who had been on morphine? Mr. Johnson says Letby had no memory of this. He says Letby had been responsible for the admission process for Child K. He says the cross-examination at this time was a somewhat torturous process. He relays the cross-examination of this, in which he concluded he got told off for saying they danced the dance in arriving at that point. He says he got there in the end, in that Letby was in room 1 to obtain the medical notes for Child K to input the admission details on the computer. This was on a record between 6:04 and 6:10am. He says those notes would then have to be returned to the cot side in room 1 afterwards. He says the coincidence between Letby's presence and Child K's desaturation is not an innocent one. He says the third event for child K happened at handover, which Mr. Johnson says was not the only occasion. Mr. Johnson says once child K's ET tube was moved to the correct position, she picked up immediately. Mr. Johnson says after nearly being caught red-handed, like in the case of child E, she pressed home her advantage and tried to create more of a problem for child K, which led her to desaturate again. She did this by moving her ET tube. Mr. Johnson refers to police interviews with Letby, in which she said child K's tube had slipped earlier in the shift. Mr. Johnson says Letby had, in interview, created the impression of innocent tube movement for child K. Mr. Johnson says Joanne Williams had left at 3:47 a.m. to see child K's mother and had left Lucy Letby babysitting room 1, Letby having fed a designated baby. It had been suggested to Dr. J-Ram he was inventing an allegation for Lucy Letby to cover for shortcomings in child K. What did Dr. J-Ram invent? What was it that was so offensive to their case? Dr. J-Ram walked into room 1 and saw Letby by the incubator. What was Letby's case here? Mr. Johnson says he can't help the jury as Letby was saying one thing and then said another. He says if the jury is confused, then they have to ask why. He says the reason is because Letby won't commit herself. He asks if that is the case, then why? Dr. J-Ram said child K's observations dropped. This was not disputed. The alarm was not on. That again was not disputed. He said the cause was a displaced tube. This was not disputed. Is Dr. J-Ram a wicked liar to make up allegations about one of his colleagues, or is he telling the truth? Mr. Johnson adds, what lie did Dr. J-Ram tell? We suggest it's all smoke and mirrors, that all these doctors are bad, that they tell lies, that they stitch up Lucy Letby. Mr. Johnson says evidence was heard to say a nurse would not leave a baby unattended without checking the tube was secure. Joanne Williams had checked the equipment and made sure the tube was in a secure position. A big play was made of the high air leak on the ventilator. It had been accepted the ventilator was suboptimal, but said the oxygen saturations were optimal. Mr. Johnson says the leak was not having any impact on child K. A note was made of, quote, large blood-stained oral secretions by Joanne Williams, but she could not confirm she had been present to see that. A doctor had said if he had seen bloodstains during reintubation of child K, he would have noted it and made Dr. J-Ram aware. Mr. Johnson says that note of large blood-stained oral secretions had only come from Lucy Letby and was entirely typical behaviour by Lucy Letby. He says in child K's remaining days before she passed away, the ET tube did not dislodge again. Mr. Johnson counts the number of seconds, each one up to 30, for a 25-week gestational age baby desaturating, which he says was the sight Letby saw from child K's cot side. It's uncomfortable, isn't it? Even talking about it is uncomfortable. That is why it's attempted murder. Nicholas Johnson KC is turning to the cases of child O and child P. He says the evidence of Dr. Marnarides is uncontested that child O had a significant liver injury. That injury and the lacerations in the surface of the liver are the best evidence you could ever have of someone inflicting a violent injury on a small child, he tells the court. Lucy Letby's help post-it note is shown to the court. Mr. Johnson says it began with the note to all three triplets, quote, today is your birthday, but you aren't here, and I am so sorry for that. I'm sorry you couldn't have a chance at life. I can't do this anymore. I want someone to help me, but they can't. What's the point in asking? Hate my life. Mr. Johnson says this note would have been written in June 2017 or June 2018. The note was found in Letby's handbag. Mr. Johnson moves on to talk about Dr. John Gibbs. Dr. John Gibbs had said the deaths of child O and child P were a tipping point, that something was very wrong on the neonatal unit. he had been asked in cross-examination why he hadn't reported that to the police. He said, "At that stage, I didn't know 2 children had been poisoned with insulin. Medicine is not an exact science. Just occasionally a patient dies, and a post-mortem examination does not give an answer. But this was happening again and again on our unit, and that cannot be coincidence or bad luck. There must be a cause." That's when one common cause was identified. Mr. Johnson tells the jury they have one advantage, and that is they know 2 children were poisoned with insulin, and they know who hung up the bags. Mr. Johnson tells the court there had been no concerns for child O or child P on the shifts prior to the deterioration. Letby had, in evidence, said concerns had been raised by Sophie Ellis and were not dealt with. Mr. Johnson says Letby is trying to persuade the jury that a problem existed when there was none available. Dr. Maybury remembered child O, and he was, quote, "very well with a mildly distended abdomen, but all observations within normal limits." Mr. Johnson says Letby's issue for child O did not exist. He says Letby pointed out that Dr. Maybury did not make a note. Mr. Johnson says there were 2 occasions when Letby made up notes for doctors. One was a telephone call in the case of child E, and another was the imaginary examination of child I by a doctor. Mr. Johnson says Sophie Ellis's notes record that, quote, "Reg Maybury was involved in being informed and reviewed on June 23, 2016 for child O. That was the difference," Mr. Johnson explains, as Letby's notes do not attribute any doctor. Mr. Johnson says student nurse Rebecca Morgan was on her first day on the ward. She fed child O and got a trace aspirate. Shift leader Melanie Taylor said there were no concerns for child O at the start of the shift. Quote, "She did not expect child O to collapse." An examination of child O's abdomen revealed no concerns, and this situation was uncomplicated. It also ruled out the possibility of liver hematomas at that stage. Had there been one, child O would have had symptoms of deteriorating. Mr. Johnson said it was accepted by Letby that child O's liver injury happened during her day shift, and she accepted the evidence of Dr. Manarides. Mr. Johnson says Letby was missing a doctor colleague. She texted him, quote, "Bit rubbish that you couldn't stay on NNU." He replied at 10:36 a.m, saying he should be finished on clinic duty in an hour. He then went on to observe child Q on his arrival. He then saw child O. Letby recorded no problems at 12:30 p.m. Mr. Johnson says it is obvious child O was deliberately overfed by Letby at this stage. There was an issue at 1:15 p.m. Mr. Johnson says child O had been supposedly fed 13 ml of milk. By this stage he had vomited and his abdomen was distended. Letby was fulfilling 2 objectives, Mr. Johnson says, by sabotaging child O and attracting the attention of the doctor at the same time. Letby had recorded child O was tachycardic, which Mr. Johnson says was an exaggeration. Samantha O'Brien had said in agreed evidence, child O had a distended abdomen but looked otherwise normal. Letby messaged, quote, "Blew up abdomen, think it's sepsis," to a nursing colleague at 9:15 p.m. And for child P the following day, quote, "Just blew tummy up and had apneas, downward spiral similar to child O." Mr. Johnson says the 1:15 p.m. vomiting by child O was unusual as observed by a doctor. But Mr. Johnson says this is not so much in the context of child E, child F, child G and child L. Mr. Johnson says Letby made a false reading for child O at 1:20 p.m. on the blood gas chart. Even by the standards of misrecording information, this is right up there. He says the note child O was put onto CPAP from Optiflow was a lie, and it had been spotted by Dr. Sandy Bowen. Mr. Johnson says someone looking at the paperwork retrospectively might conclude this note could form an innocent explanation as to why child O had died. Letby had said in evidence he wasn't on full CPAP machine, he may have been receiving CPAP via Neopuff, I don't know. A doctor had noted child O's abdomen was distended. Mr. Johnson says this was because Letby had pumped child O full of air. Nurse Melanie Taylor had said to Letby, "I don't think he looks as well as he did before," and queried if child O should be moved to nursery room 1. Letby had said no, to leave child O in room 2 with his brother. Lucy Letby was so insistent, Melanie Taylor felt put out. She felt undermined. Mr. Johnson explains Facebook messages were exchanged between Letby and a doctor. Child O collapsed a few minutes after the last message Letby sent. Professor Arthurs said the gas in child O's bowel, as shown in an X-ray from that afternoon, was more there than should be. The causes were NEC, which Mr. Johnson says had been ruled out, or someone injecting air down the nasogastric tube. Mr. Johnson says this is even after a vomit, which would decompress the stomach. Mr. Johnson says the liver injury for child O had been inflicted around this stage, and this was long before CPR. A small rash had been seen on child O's chest, a purpuric rash which is very, very rare in a neonatal infant, similar to a sign of meningitis. Dr. Stephen Breary, who had noted it, thought at the time it could have been a sign of sepsis.